We will be discussing aphasia, which is a disorder acquired typically during adulthood. It is not characterized as a speech disorder alone. In addition to affecting spoken language, it produces disturbances in comprehending the speech of others, reading, and writing. Aphasia is a general term that's used to describe a number of related but separate problems, as we will discuss later. It refers to a breakdown in the ability to formulate, retrieve, or decode the arbitrary symbols of language. Aphasia typically occurs with an abrupt onset, and it is brought on by injury to the head, brain tumors, and other neurological diseases. Most frequently, aphasia is caused by a stroke. Speaking, reading, writing, and comprehending are all cognitive activities. Therefore, damage to the cerebral cortex, or the covering of the cerebrum, is most likely to produce aphasia. Damage to the cortex is known as cortical damage. Damage to the structures underneath and connected to the cortex are called subcortical damage, and that can result in aphasia as well. So just to review, the cerebrum consists of two halves that are roughly similar in shape and size. Each half, however, does unique things. We're going to discuss the types of cortical activities, motor, sensory, and cognitive, in terms of their hemispheric control. First, we're going to speak about movement or motor behavior. So without control of our speech muscles, we'll be unable to put our thoughts into words and share them with the world. At this time, neuromotor control, or how our brain controls the muscles of our body, is not quite exactly understood. We do know that for highly skilled motor behavior, the concept of contralateral innervation plays a huge role. So we spoke about this a little bit last week. Contralateral innervation is the general pattern of neural control in which one side of the body is controlled by the opposite side of the brain. So the left half, or left cerebral hemisphere, controls the movement of the right side of the body, and the right half, or right cerebral hemisphere, controls the left side of the body. Nerve fibers decussate or cross over just before the junction between the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. Therefore, if cortical brain damage results in some motor impairment, and it usually does, we can observe a paralysis of the body opposite of the brain damage. So hemiplegia is the paralysis of one side of the body. A slight or incomplete paralysis is called hemiparesis. We could use hemiplegia and hemiparesis as clinicians to predict the side of the brain damage. So if a left hemiplegia is noted, we can infer that there was right hemisphere damage to the brain. The next cortical activity we are going to talk about is sensation or sensory behavior. So the sensory systems that are most important to language are vision and audition. In humans, the visual pathways are partially crossed. This crossing occurs just behind the eyeballs. Beyond this crossing point, damage either to the optic pathways or to the area of the cortex that receives visual impulses causes a loss of vision of one half of what is being viewed. This loss is called hemianopsia. An interruption of the left optic tract or occipital lobe, therefore, would cause the loss of the right half of the visual space. The loss of the same visual half field of both eyes is identified by the term homonymous. Hence, we have a right homonymous hemianopsia. So, auditory information is distributed to both hemispheres. Approximately 70% of the auditory fibers from each ear cross to the opposite hemisphere. Few, if any, effects on hearing sensitivity are caused by purely cortical damage. Deafness in one ear occurs as a result to damage to the ear itself or the sensory pathways below the level of the cortex. The last cortical activity we're going to discuss is cognition. It's long been recognized that aphasia usually occurs with damage to the left hemisphere and that people with right brain damage usually escape it. Thus, the left brain was considered the dominant hemisphere for a long time. There was also an implication that the right hemisphere was sort of a spare part, only called into thinking operations when the left brain was damaged. Additionally, it was believed that in left-handed individuals, the situation was reversed, with the left being the cognitive spare part. Advances in cognitive neuroscience have altered this simple view. Far from being subservient, the right hemisphere is now considered to make its own distinctive contribution to our thinking skills. In short, the right hemisphere is thought to play a major role in nonverbal aspects of cognition, such as visual spatial problem-solving skills, artistic and creative mental activities. Thus, for most of us, neither hemisphere is dominant. Each is different and appears to support different types of cognitive activity. Neuroscientists are using tools such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, as you see in this slide right here, and positron emission tomography, which is PET scans. That'll be in the next slide. These tools can be used to observe the normal and abnormal brain when it performs complex activities. This has definitely challenged a lot of our traditional beliefs, like I just mentioned before. So, for example, the right hemisphere appears to be involved in language to a greater extent than was previously thought. Even parts of the brain that were thought to play a very limited role in cognitive processing, such as the cerebellum, are often shown to be active in fMRI or PET scans, depending on the specific nature of the task. So the image you see on your screen shows a lateral or side view of the left hemisphere. The regions of the cortex posterior to or behind the fissure of Rolando and above the Sylvian fissure are primarily responsible for analyzing sensations coming in from the outside world. The occipital lobe is specialized for vision, the parietal for somatic sensory analysis, and the temporal lobe for audition. The area directly anterior to or in front of the fissure of Rolando initiates movement. The functions of the areas even more forward in the frontal lobe are more subtle and harder to see. The frontal lobes appear to have a responsibility for directing individuals as they negotiate their environments. So as you can see, the area surrounding the Sylvian fissure is shaded. This is the general area of the left hemisphere, which is thought to be primarily responsible for speech and language functions. If you notice the portions that are even darker, the dark spot on the temporal parietal lobe is termed Wernicke's area. The one on the frontal lobe is called Broca's area. Now I'm going to speak a little bit about the posterior language area. The posterior cortex deals with reception and analysis of stimuli from the outside world. Wernicke's area lies in the temporal lobe, which is related to auditory stimuli, and the posterior speech region extends upward into the parietal area, where somatic sensation is integrated. Brain damage to this area is associated with disturbances to input of language and understanding of speech. Damage to Wernicke's area causes difficulties with comprehending speech and difficulties reading. Further back in the posterior language area is a place of convergence for visual, auditory, and sensory stimuli. So damage here results in difficulties with reading, writing, and naming. The most important thing I want you guys to take home from this slide is that posterior brain damage does not affect the area of the brain responsible for initiating and producing speech. So disorders with posterior lesions are considered fluent. It does not affect speech production. So now we'll talk about the anterior or frontmost language area. The frontal lobe is responsible for movement and its initiation. Therefore, the anterior language area is responsible for speaking. Damage in the anterior area is less likely to affect comprehension. Instead, it's going to result in non-fluent speech. Just so you guys know, for aphasia, the words fluent and non-fluent have a slightly different meaning than they do for stuttering. So, in addition to slow, labored speech, anterior damage causes articulatory problems and motor programming deficits. And the takeaway point I want you guys to have from this slide is that anterior damage results in non-fluent aphasia. So this concludes the first lecture in our aphasia module. I hope you guys found going over the neuroanatomic structure of the brain helpful, and I hope it helps everything click together in the future when we start to talk about the specific types of aphasia. Thank you.